So hello, everybody. It's really thrilling to be here with you today, and especially to see so many names I recognize in that list of participants joining us. I prepared today a talk. I'm going to share my screen. A talk called Citizens of Memory, the Art of Human Rights. But I'd like to begin actually by sharing a little bit of my history and how I got to the subject that I research and that I've been studying for over 20 years now. I was actually born in Berkeley. That's a picture of my father with my older sister, Sandra. He was at Berkeley studying economics. He received a PhD in economics from Berkeley, and I was born during that time. So I joined my sister, my mother, and my father in Oakland, California. But when I was 3, we moved back to Argentina. He'd finished his PhD and lived there until I was 6. Something about me that has been really key to the way that I think about the subjects I study is that growing up before college, and actually before grad school, I never spent more than 3 years in a row in one place. I kept shuttling back and forth between the United States and Latin America. When I was 6, my father got a position with the IMF, so we moved to Washington, D.C. And then we spent some time in Ecuador. I was actually there in 1976 when the coup happened in Argentina. And then I spent some really formative years in middle school in Uruguay. And I chose this photograph, not because I appear in it, that's not me, standing next to Dr. Giral, my English teacher at the Uruguayan American School. But I chose this photo because it's the only one I have of him. And he was a really, really influential figure in my upbringing. I would only discover much later, actually, when I was writing the book that I'm drawing on from today, that he had been a professor at the university that who had lost his position when the military junta intervened the university and closed his position, which meant that he needed to survive, and he came to teach at the Uruguayan American School. So the history of dictatorship, as I've discovered through the years, runs much closer to me than I was even aware at the time. We left Uruguay when I was in 10th grade, and I finished high school in Bethesda, Maryland, and ended up at Stanford studying English. I had always been drawn to books. It was the way I made sense of the world. Literature helped me understand what I was living through. And being bilingual, with Spanish being my first language and English being my second, I was drawn to the English department at Stanford. I didn't study Spanish. But having spent 4 years there, I decided that in graduate school, I really wanted to come back to Latin American history and culture. So I chose to go to Duke for grad school because Ariel Dorfman was teaching there. And I met him on a campus visit. Ariel Dorfman is a Chilean human rights activist and novelist, author, public intellectual, who also helped me understand that out of the misery of dictatorship can come an aesthetic of hope. And I've never forgotten that. So once I graduated from Duke, I took a position at DePaul University as assistant professor, and I spent 3 years there before coming to William and Mary, where I've been since, as Tim said, 1999. And I was really drawn to William and Mary because um, the students, the faculty just blew my mind when I came on my campus visit in terms of the possibilities. And we can talk a little bit more about that after my formal remarks. So I wanted to start with this personal journey because it's really shaped my approach to cultural production in post-conflict societies, and particularly my study of post-dictatorship Argentina. If we talk about post-dictatorship, we've got to figure out, what is this dictatorship that she keeps on referring to? And I know that some of you know this history, but I'll review it with everybody anyway. Argentina's last dictatorship, and I say last because Argentina's history is riddled with dictatorships, but Argentina's last dictatorship, and perhaps its most brutal in modern history, was ranged from 1976 to 1983. This period in the United States is known as the Dirty War. So some of you may have heard of it spoken in that way. It's characterized by the number of disappeared, approximately 30,000 is the estimate human rights organizations give. And we say disappeared because victims of the dictatorship were actually abducted in plain daylight, often from work, sometimes from their homes, and taken to clandestine detention centers where they were tortured and usually killed. There were more than 600 clandestine detention centers all over the nation, and many of them today have been converted into sites of memory. The state repression was also coordinated across state lines, so with other dictatorial regimes, especially Chile, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay through Operation Condor. So there was no way out. If you were somebody who was engaged in any kind of activity that the military regime considered suspect or subversive, and you tried to leave Argentina and go to neighboring Chile or neighboring Uruguay, the intelligence operation in those countries would also track you down and turn you in or detain you, process you, disappear you. In addition to this, about 500 infants born in captivity often, so women who were detained, abducted while they were pregnant, were kept alive in clandestine detention centers until they gave birth. And then once they gave birth, those infants were appropriated by families sympathetic to the regime, or maybe by somebody who worked in the clandestine detention center, and their identities stolen, never to know what their biological history was, who their parents were, and under what circumstances they came to be in the family that raised them. These children are still being sought by the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, and there's about over 350 still left to be identified and found. And then there were thousands exiled. So people who did manage to get out, some of them to this country. How in Argentina we remember and narrate the story of what happened during this period is the focus of the book I published in 2017, Citizens of Memory, which has just appeared this week in Spanish translation, which I'm really thrilled about. The book brings together 2 decades of research that began with undergraduate students. And I'll show you a picture of me, much younger, with John Sipperly and Sarah South Parks. Thanks to a Borgenecht Identity and Transformation Grant, we were able to travel in 2002 to Latin America, namely Chile and Argentina, to examine how the traumatic past of dictatorship manifested almost 2 decades later in the urban landscape. That's the question that drew us there. These questions were inspired by the work of M.C. Boyer, who refers to the city as the theater of our memory. If the city is indeed the theater of our memory, what traces of this dark history would we find in the built environment? And what kind of collective memory were these traces helping to generate? So as it turns out, our trip south, again, I applied for the grant in 2001 and we traveled in 2002, our summer. Our trip south coincided with one of the most significant crises in Argentina's history, the economic, social, and political collapse of December 2001. And I've joked since, and perhaps it's a joke in bad taste, but I've joked since that if a country can go over the edge, Argentina went over the edge in December of 2001. This period also, however, set the stage for an effusive eruption of memory in the Buenos Aires cityscape. So, as I said, on this trip, we traveled to both Chile and Argentina, in part because of the crisis. We were so worried about the crisis in Argentina that we decided to minimize our time there and spend some time that we had previously allocated to Argentina to Chile, where things were quieter and safer, and indeed where the memory of dictatorship seemed to be much more deeply buried than it was in the Argentina of 2002. One of the most eloquent depictions of this memory in the cityscape was the memory mural that we found painted outside the Film Museum in the city's historic core, created by a grassroots collective on occasion of the 26th anniversary of the coup. So it had been freshly painted just a few months before when we got there. In these selections, you can see that it's a film strip that starts with the date of the coup, 1976, and ends with an image of the protests that engulfed Argentina in 2001. So those are tires set on fire, referencing the piqueteros who would block roads to interrupt traffic, stop traffic and stop commerce and stop ordinary life, right? To call attention to their plight. The film strip actually narrates the last quarter of a century as part of one and the same story. A story that links state repression to neoliberal economic policies and a continuum of structural violence, as well as popular resistance. Now, it's important to understand that at this time, this was a counter narrative to that which had been circulating since the end of the dictatorship and the transition to democracy in 1983. And I'll just kind of map it out for you briefly. Initially, right at the end of the dictatorship, what dominated in terms of official memory was the two demon theory. The two demon theory held that the dictatorship was a war between two sets of bad actors, two demons, the guerrillas and the state, with much of civil society trapped in between. And this is why the term dirty war also was widely used at that time, guerra sucia. It's the version that predominates in the brilliant Oscar-winning film, The Official Story. But this discourse was starting to give way at this time to one of human rights that named the use of force against citizens state terrorism. So we go from two demons or dirty war to actually thinking about the dictatorship as state terrorism or state repression. At the time, again, during the transition before 2002, there was also a dichotomy constructed that posed dictatorship and democracy as stark polar opposites. The transition brought an end, a jubilant end to a dictatorship. Democracy had been won. We conquered, this evil. And the idea was that that was firmly now part of our past, never again to be repeated. And also, by the time the 90s rolled around, there was a discourse of forgetting and reconciliation in the name of progress that was dominant. We didn't want to be looking backwards. We wanted to be looking forward. So when the crisis of 2001 hit, everything got sort of stirred up again. And we see this in the mural. Rather than positing a definitive end to authoritarianism and state violence with a return to democracy, so a discourse of rupture, the mural indicates a continuity marked by repression, austerity, corruption, and impunity, and also calls on civil society to change the script. And the mural actually ends with a picture of the comic book character Mafalda saying, let's change the film script. So sort of inviting people to action. And if in the 90s, forgetting and amnesty dominated the field of recollection, this refrain would soon be drowned out by the calls for memory and justice of activist citizens. One of the most eloquent expressions of the struggle for memory at the time was the site of the clandestine detention and torture center known as Club Atlético. And this is a scene of that site from our trip in 2002. So what was Club Atlético? It was a clandestine detention center that functioned from February to December of 1977, so less than a year. But during that time, approximately 1,500 victims passed through its doors. The majority remain disappeared today. The center was demolished in 1978 to make way for the freeway that was being constructed. And it's sort of like a beltway that goes around the city of Buenos Aires. So what you see in the image are the pillars that hold up the freeway. So literally the center was buried and the victims, the people who were being held there, were either killed or transferred to other detention centers. This site turned out to be the perfect metaphor for what was happening in Argentina in 2001, 2002. And that is that histories that had been buried and silenced in the name of progress, and here think freeway, commerce, development, right? We buried the center because we were building that freeway. We're literally being unearthed as a result of citizen activists who reclaimed the space for themselves and for those who had been lost, demanding memory and justice. So the site in 1996 became a site of struggle. What you see was not there. It was just basically dirt and a sidewalk. And the freeway pillars. But people from the area started coming to the site, trying to establish it as the place where their loved ones or they themselves had been detained. And these struggles to mark the site lasted for 6 years, from 1996 to 2002, On one occasion, a totem was created there, made out of paper, and it was torn down, burnt down by other actors overnight, only to be rebuilt, right? And so these gestures to try to reclaim the space and reclaim the memory of what had happened there went on for approximately 6 years until the legislature of the city of Buenos Aires agreed to begin the excavation. And since then, it's been transformed into a site of memory with the totem, the last version of the totem, these figures that are wrapped around one of the highway pillars, blindfolded and shackled, trying to emerge from the depths in which they were buried to the light, became permanent. The site as it appears today spans both sides of the street. On the left, you see Memorial Plaza. It's hard to see, but you can actually see the numbers 30,000 hanging up above the plaza, that where ceremonies and educational workshops and protests and marches and gatherings are held. And across the street, the site of the excavation, which continues to this day, they haven't paused. They continue to unearth artifacts that correspond to the period of the clandestine detention center. So one of the things that that really caught my attention, and I'm going to go back to the image of the way that this site was found in 2000. We found the site in 2002. Is that the site appears to have almost organically developed, like somebody painted that blue and white Argentine flag on one of those pillars and hand wrote the poem by Juan Gelman on the pillars. Juan Gelman being one of the most important poets from Argentina, whose son was disappeared, and who gave voice to that tragedy through his oeuvre. The other thing that you see is that this is work under construction. It's not finished. And it's in the middle of the city. So you're on the bus and you go right by this place, right? If you go down the highway ramp, you're gonna see this excavation and wonder what's happening there. And so it invites us in and opens us up to learning more about what actually happened here without telling us how to feel about it or what to think about it. It works as a site of memory, I think, in part because of its location, because it's central, in part because it catches us off guard, right? We're walking along and all of a sudden there it is. In part because of its juxtaposition to the freeway that makes us think about, what the cost was of the economic programs, right, that were being deployed by the military under dictatorship. And it works because of the art that has been embedded in the site, the totem, the poetry, the paintings, the sculptures. So in the course of my, my study, I was really struck by how often visual registers, art in particular, was used to communicate trauma and also to process the trauma of this past. And so I tried to look for theorists that could help me explain why this was so. And one hypothesis that I found particularly persuasive, drawn from Jill Bennett's work, is that we engage with art at subconscious and conscious levels. So both as creators of art, but also as consumers of art. Art often communicates something, makes us feel something before we're able to put it into words, before we're able to actually narrate it. So, and trauma works in a similar way. Um, so I turned in the study as from sites of memory like the Atlético to look at the work of photographers. And I'd like to end my remarks today by sharing with you one example, and that is the work of Marcelo Brodsky, pictured here before his installation, Buena Memoria, or Good Memory. Turns out that photographs are an excellent vehicle for memorial transmission because they're of the past and simultaneously of the present. They capture a moment that has passed. Now, as soon as it's been captured, that moment has passed, but we return to them always in a present that gives them meaning. And so they become fantastic vehicles for memorial transmission. A little bit about Brodsky. Brodsky lost his brother, Fernando, during the dictatorship. Fernando was abducted and detained in the ISMA, one of the biggest clandestine detention centers from which he disappeared. Marcelo Brodsky spent the dictatorship in exile in Barcelona, where he also studied photography. And then at the end of the dictatorship, he returned to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and spent the next decade or so developing this installation, Buena Memoria. Buena Memoria, or good memory, is made up of several elements. The central element is his class photo. So this is a photo blown up to 6 times its original size and marked up by him. So it's not that we're looking at the photograph as it was when it was first taken and put in a photo album, right? Stored away, my 8th grade class photo. We're looking at what Brodsky did with it. He actually circled and crossed out the classmates that were killed or disappeared by the military dictatorship. He circled those who went into exile, and he writes with his handwriting how the dictatorship affected them. Almost in the center of the photograph, we see him with a little handwriting that says, "I am a photographer and I miss my friend Martin." Martin is the image, the figure to his right, actually it would be his left, our right, circled and crossed out, who was a victim of the dictatorship. In front of some figures, he simply writes, "Vive," he lives, as if that's enough. And then he also doodles like, what, I don't know what to make of this. So what he's actually doing is tracing the wounds, the damage done by the dictatorship that has yet to heal. And we return then to a moment in the past as filtered by the lens of trauma. He invites us to look back, and he simultaneously marks an impossible return. There is no going back. So why does he title this installation with this class photo at its center, Good Memory, or Buena Memoria? Is it because it's a good memory of a time in the past when we were all innocent, so tinged with nostalgia? Is it a good memory in the sense that now, like with this sort of violated with the pen, right, marked up, it's accurate, right? Is it a good memory because it's a positive memory? Is it a good memory because it's productive? So, what is it that makes it a good memory? And I'd suggest it's all of that, right? And it's and I'll talk a little bit more about how he arrives at the title because it actually comes from another part of the installation that I'll get to in just a second. But what I think is important here is to think about the symbolism encoded in the image of a class that was being educated for greatness, for leadership, for citizenship at the Colegio Nacional, the national school, which was like the charter school in the city of Buenos Aires that all of the brightest students went to. You could only get in, with an exam. Um, and so this is a school that educated leaders, a public school that was meant to um, educate future citizens. And what the government did was deform that education by intervening through its repression. The junta corrected, right, by killing, by exiling, by wounding a whole generation and their vision for the future. They disciplined this class, right, through the dictatorship. So it makes us think about the role of public schools. It also makes us think about our own class photos and what would the exercise look like if we went back to our own class photo. It appeals to us on the level of, this is familiar territory. I also have a class photo. What if what if my photo looked like this, right, in terms of outcomes? So editing the body politic through the eradication of subversive elements, the scribbles that Brodsky, sort of the writing of Brodsky, overwrites the potential inscribed in this class educated for leadership with that violent re-education imposed by the regime. The feelings the marks connote transmit the material and affective legacies of repression. And so feelings like loss, frustration, pain, denial, bewilderment all emerge in multicolor clarity. By marking the photo with the fates of those pictured, Brodsky not only makes their wounds legible, articulating them so as to fix them into a collective history, he also weaves a counter narrative to that disseminated by the junta and later by a democratic state focused on reconciliation and forgetting. And I'm thinking here mid-90s, right? 1996 is a year of the photo. It's when this is happening. Menem is president. He's all about amnesty, forgetting, not looking back, but only looking forward. Filling in fragments missing from the public record, Brodsky renders intelligible some of the damage done, and he begins to reconstruct a partial collective history of affect based on his own experience of loss. But he doesn't stop there, because what does he do with this enlarged, marked up photo? He returns it to the site where it began. He exhibits it at the National School on the first sort of commemoration of the schools disappeared. And there are a lot of alumni disappeared from the Colegio Nacional. So he brings it back to the site, right, of violence. And he engages the youth, who are students at the time, in conversation about this history. In this way, he encourages and generates a space for intergenerational dialogue. He calls this, and then he captures that, right? The act at the school, the students looking at the photo, he captures that and turns it into a photo essay that is part of the installation, that becomes part and parcel of Buena Memoria, calling it Memory Bridge. The act of bearing witness that Memory Bridge captures completes this way the creative cycle that began with the marking up of the class photo. As Brodsky himself clarifies, the pictures remained on exhibit in the school for a few days. The light of the sun at its zenith penetrated the enormous windows of the hall, shone on the faces of the students who stopped to look, and reflected them on the glass that protected the altered photographs. The portraits of those reflections constitute a fundamental part of this project, as they represent the instance of the transmission of experience from one generation to the next. And as one of the students featured in Memory Bridge notes, that experience was to feel history, feel a part and continuation of it, heirs of lived experiences. Those photos enabled me to feel really identified with the disappeared, but also something I had never seen was achieved. Throughout the day, adults and children shared feelings and knowledge with each other. Those photos made memory of the good kind possible. And that's where I think he gets the title, Good Memory, Buena Memoria. By promoting a kind of understanding that can help catalyze new projects, Brodsky's installation enables these young students to come face to face with their own school's living history, empathize with what the image text shows, and feel something in response. If, as several of the testimonies stress, the photo exhibit activates a good kind of memory, it's because by encouraging an emotional response in its viewers, it triggers an active process of engagement and appropriation. Good because it demands its viewers wrestle with its meanings while enabling their own myriad interpretations. Art is open to interpretation. Good to the extent that it is simultaneously personal and representative, communicative and silent, of the past and of the present. Good because it is not arbitrary, but rather framed in such a way that it incites beholders to imagine who these kids were, who they wanted to be, and the life projects the dictatorship cut short. Good because it pays tribute to the living as well as the dead without renouncing complexity. Reminding us that memory is not then simply the effect of a trace, but rather a way of articulating those traces, of making them meaningful. Brodsky's exhibit serves as an occasion for recollection, fragmented, messy, contradictory, exhilarating, and painful, that moves us just a little bit closer to that never again we vowed at dictatorship's end. And that is all I have for you in terms of my prepared remarks, so I'll stop sharing.
So Silvia, I am going to post in chat remind people how they might want to ask you questions.
Sure.
But I thought I'd start things off with a question of my own. The idea of people disappearing is kind of horrifying if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
When 1 minute the people who are your child, your father, your husband, your wife are in your life and in the moment, and then they're gone. And as a phenomenon, the way you were talking about this is being kind of recaptured in this memory work as a phenomenon. But I wondered if you could also talk about the the very personal work of what happened to this person who was in my life? How do I recover the story of what happened?
Yeah. So I think that in part, that's what's so haunting about this period and about the dictatorship, that there's never any closure. Because when somebody was disappeared, what would happen is a relative, a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, and the mothers of Plaza de Mayo are the most famous icon of this, would start going from, one police station to the next, trying to find, right, their missing child relative. And they would be turned away from one, police station to the next. There would be no trace of this person. So they wouldn't have any closure, right? If somebody is detained and in jail, you know where they are, right? For political crimes or whatever, you know where they are. If somebody has a death sentence and is executed, publicly, right? You know that that's the end, and you can mourn, right, that person. But when you don't know where your loved one is and what's happened, there's no closure. So it's the kind of crime that, there's no body. I mean, the dictatorship used this because without a body, there couldn't be a crime, right? There was no body of evidence. So you're in limbo. And in fact, one of the chapters of my book focuses on a novel that takes its point of departure as the disappeared husband shows up 30 years later in New Jersey, in a suburb of New Jersey, and he hasn't aged a day. And you've got to figure out, is the woman, who sees him, who recovers him, crazy? Has she lost her mind? Or is it possible that the disappeared can actually come back, right? But that sense of being in limbo, of not being able to ever mourn because you don't know that this person is dead, is excruciating. And some of the work that I've done more recently with some of the students who I know are here, I see you, Grayson, and Ariana, and Erin, and some others, of trying to give some sense of closure to relatives of the disappeared by scouring declassified US documents that actually tell us what happened to some of them, is some of the work that we're doing today, right? So we have identified US government documents shared by our intelligence representatives in Argentina with the State Department or the CIA, the FBI offices here in the United States, reporting on what was happening in Argentina. Through those documents, we've been able to provide some closure to some families, because names of the disappeared, for example, appear as having been executed at this clandestine detention center, or being detained and held at this other center. That is a little bit of closure that the work that we are doing today can provide. But you're right, the crime of disappearance is one that never ends until you have a body and a body to bury.
This, I'm just going to keep going. We don't have any questions yet. So these communal acts of remembrance are a way of together kind of helping each other celebrate the disappeared, but also pick up the pieces, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, about the value of, or maybe the resilience of people finding their own way forward, not the government's sort of rosy, optimistic thing, but step by step on their own?
Yeah, so it's interesting because for a very long time, during the transition to democracy and the two demon theory, there was some shame in talking about, militants who had disappeared, right? They were demons, right? And what's happened over the last, 30, 40 years is that that narrative has been through the work of human rights activists and a lot of uh, turmoil and change. Um, Families have been able to, and particularly the children of the disappeared, have been able to recover the stories of their parents. So militants who were detained, who were killed, who were called demons, right, during the transition, over time, their stories have been recovered and resignified so that there is pride in the father who was fighting for, a free bus ticket to school-age children, right? Or who was working in the shanty towns on alfabetización, literacy work, to make, the futures possible, better for those groups. So what the work of commemoration, of creating a space, giving the disappeared a space where we can mourn them, but also recognize their legacies of resistance and learn from those struggles, what it was that they dreamed of, what they were fighting for, right? That is tremendously healing. There's a place not only to deposit your pain, but also a return to dreaming again, with your parents, for a different future, and recovering some of those activist legacies.
It's really interesting to me. So the way shaping your own future as opposed to a propaganda future makes all the difference. Hey, we have one question. Um, when did they start teaching in the schools in Argentina about the dirty wars? When did that become officially possible to be part of the curriculum, I guess?
Pretty quickly, um, uh, with the transition to democracy in the 80s. Problem was that the ways in which this history was taught was that discourse of rupture. There was this terrible period we had a dictatorship, and now we have democracy. Yay, everything's fixed, right? Never again. We'll never go back to that. As opposed to enabling students to think, and to study and to engage with what had happened through the lens of the present and understand the continuities, that we still have police violence, that we still have state repression, that we still have certain sectors that are persecuted, that human rights are being violated every day, right? And what can we do about it? The other problem in terms of teaching this in the schools was that that everybody had been the teachers, right? They had all been protagonists. And so depending on the role they had played or their relationship to this history, it was very, very difficult to know how to teach it. And there weren't resources provided for like workshops, teaching workshops like we'd have at William and Mary, right? For how to address these very, very difficult subjects, particularly when in the classroom, you could have the children of, a torturer, and the children of a victim sitting in the same, seventh grade class. So, so it took a very, very, very long time to figure out how to teach this in a constructive way so as to achieve that result, right? That we were hoping for, educate students to value human rights, to fight and defend them, and to understand that democracy is worth fighting for, and that we have to be vigilant, right? That we have to defend those rights every day consistently, that it's not something that's won once and for all, right? And can never be lost again. I don't know that we still have it right. I think that there are some programs like the program at the Comisión Provincial por la Memoria that are fantastic, but they are supplements to a public school system that still struggles with how to teach this story, which is not unlike what happens, I would say, in this country when we get to topics like, indigenous histories and slavery, for example, right? How to teach those experiences that were so traumatic for our nation and so integral to who we are as a nation, right? It's not easy.
And maybe it shouldn't be. We have another question. I'm going to read this one because it's a little complicated. You said early on that photography, like trauma, makes us feel a certain way before we can narrate the experience. At what point does affect evolve into narration? What are the requirements and mechanisms necessary for this evolution?
It's a great question. I wish I knew. I don't know the answer. I think maybe I saw that Janice was with us. Maybe Janice will have a better answer for this from the psychological perspective, but I'm not a psychologist. What I will say is that as practitioners of art, we know that people who've experienced trauma can sometimes or often express that, the feelings that rise from it through visual marks, and that it takes longer to put that into words, to actually create a consistent, logical narration of what it is that happened. So, and I think that work with young children is possibly, and art therapy is possibly linked to this. In my experience as a consumer of art, I know that I might see something that gives me a jolt, or that makes me want to lean in and look more closely, or that puzzles me or confuses me or moves me in some way. And that act of being moved by a work of art is affect, right? That's all affect is. It's being moved. And so when I'm moved, I'm experiencing something, but only through further reflection, through further thought and working through what it is about it, do I end up being able to explain it to a third person. So that's how I view the relationship between the visual processing of trauma and the narrative. And I think for me, it's linked to why the visual register is so important in these histories that come out of post-conflict settings. Because so often we don't have the words to narrate the pain. And I always go back to Elaine Scarry and The Body in Pain and the work that she did with torture, and the idea that when we are tortured, when our bodies are tortured, we're released to utterance, to screams, right? Not to words. And so that falling apart through pain, it takes a long process working through to come back to language again, as it functions on a different order. That was a lot, but I hope it was something of an answer.
I want to give everybody a chance to ask a final question if they have one that they're thinking through. We're kind of running out of time here. But Silvia, this is depressing stuff. Humans have done terrible things to other humans. There's also a kind of joy here. I wonder if you could maybe talk about that aspect of it. These people are undefeated. There's a kind of wonderfulness there.
Yeah. So I'm always awed by the creative, generative energy that comes out of these commemorative efforts. There's such beauty in the art that I've encountered that I'm always inspired. I'm inspired by human resilience, inspired by the artistry of the words that Juan Gelman writes to express his loss. There is such beauty in that, that it's joyful work because it gives us hope that even out of the most dark space, right, something can come out of it. And the work of creating a collective and imagining a better future is part of that. Feeling of solidarity is part of that.
This would be such a perfect place to end. We have one more question. Are you willing to answer it?
Sure, of course.
I'll read this one too. How do the memories memorials healing of families who stayed in Argentina compare to families who had to flee Argentina? How, if at all, was the narrative of how the dictatorship is presented or taught in Argentina impacted by people who fled and their descendants?
So I'm not one of those people who fled Argentina. My family didn't leave Argentina because we were exiled. We happened to leave Argentina before the coup because of a job opportunity for my father. But I've spent a lot of time with families outside of Argentina, Argentine families outside of Argentina. I don't think there's a clear answer to this question. A lot of the people who left also went back to Argentina. Grieving, processing trauma is very individual and also collective. And so what I'm looking at is collective forms of coming to terms with this past. And I'm looking at the work of art in the world, right? How does the work of art help us, right, build something out of the ashes? And so I would say I haven't studied this, and I'm not an ethnographer who's gone out and done a bunch of interviews, but my guess would be that memory is always of the present. So we always remember something, right, in relation to where we are, where we live, who we talk to, right? So memories are never fixed. And my guess would be that this is an evolving story, that the memories and the construction of memory that I've described at a particular moment in time, right, the late 90s and early 2000s, that it's already shifting. And that the ways in which people outside of Argentina return to this past is also colored by where they happen to be and what is triggering that memory at a particular moment in time.
So I want to thank you for being with us today and sharing your work. And I guess thank you for your work too, which I find amazing.
Thank you.
And Tim, I think you might have some final words.
Yeah, I would definitely echo Steve's thanks. Thank you, Silvia. That was fantastic. And hopefully everyone enjoyed the conversation. Tomorrow you'll receive a survey, so we'd love to get your feedback on this event, as well as input on future events. So please do take a moment to fill that out. But otherwise, thank you again, Silvia, and hope everyone has a good afternoon.
And can I just say, it means so much to me really to see so many names I recognize in the participant list. It really, you guys are awesome. Thank you for being here. Bye, everybody.